In this video, I'm going to review with you how to make sure you're using a proper keyed system when you do your in-text citations of a quote or other information from a secondary source. So an in-text citations are the citations of your source in the paragraphs of your essay. So how you're citing your quote, for example, in the essay. And the key thing with doing that is, number one, make sure you have a signal phrase to introduce a quote. But number two, and what I want to really focus on today, is to make sure that you are matching the first word of the works cited entry for your source to something in either the signal phrase before the quote or in the parentheses after the quote. That's what a keyed system means. It means you have a key word, which is the first word of the works cited entry, and you have to match to that word somewhere in your in-text citation. And the reason that's important is because if someone wants to look up your source as they're reading through your essay, they're going to look at the key word you provide in your in-text citation, and they're going to use that to scroll through all of your sources and look at the first word of each source until they find a match. That's, by the way, why we use hanging indent, because we want that first word to stick out so it's easy to scroll through them. All right, so I have a works cited entry of a source I'm using in an essay about Pride and Prejudice, and that's correctly formatted. And I want you to look at each of these four in-text citations and decide whether or not each one is correct. And of course, our key word here, our first word is Brown, right? So we need the author's last name because it begins, this entry does, with the author's last name. We need that word, Brown, somewhere in the in-text citation. So pause the video, read through A through D, and see whether you think that in-text citation is correct, and then I'll come back and talk about it. Or you can pause the video now. Okay, coming back, let's look at each one of these. So our key word is Brown because it's the first word, also the author's last name, which is very common. So A would not be correct because Brown is not anywhere in that, right? It's using the article title, which is the second thing. That's wrong. The only time you would ever use the article title in parentheses or anywhere in your in-text citation is if it was the first word of the entry, which does sometimes happen. A is also wrong because it doesn't have a signal phrase to introduce the quote, so that's bad too. All right, how about B? Well, B is also incorrect because the word Brown is nowhere in B. It's instead using the original publication source, which is a journal, as the keyword, but that doesn't match Brown, so that's wrong. C is also wrong because Brown is not in it, and it uses Gale Literature Resource Center, the name of the database. But you never put the name of the database in an in-text citation. Like, that's just not something that should ever happen, because you're either going to be referencing an author's last name, or if there's no author, a title word from the article. So D is the correct one. It has Brown in it, right? And when you have an author, it's pretty easy to do this. You just have some version of Brown says, and then your quote or other information from a source. So in this one, D is correct because it's the only one that matches the first word. Now, that's pretty easy for people to do. When your entry begins with the author's last name, you put the author in, makes sense, not a big problem. Here's where the problem occurs. What if you have an entry, like we do here, that doesn't begin with the author's last name? That's where people get into trouble, because they don't know what to do. They think, oh, I've got to have an author's last name somewhere in the citation, and that's not true. What you have to have in the citation is the first word, the key word of the entry, right? It's not about authors, it's about keywords. So the keyword here is overview. So what the in-text citation, a quote from this source, has to have in either the signal phrase or the parentheses is the word overview. So pause the video, look through A through D here, and see if you can tell whether or not each one is correct, and we'll come back. And by the way, I think there are a couple that might be correct here. So let's pause the video, and then you can look at that, and then I'll come back and give you my feedback. All right, coming back here, let's start with A. A is not correct because the word overview is not in that anywhere. So here's what some people do. If they don't find an author's name at the beginning, they just go through it and say, oh gosh, can I find a name? And they're like, oh, Kelly King House. Now that sounds like a name, so I'll just use that. But look at who she is. She's the editor of this journal. She's not the author of that article. So that's just wrong to make it sound like she's saying this. And it's not matching the keyword. All right. B, again, is wrong. It's one of these people who are using the name of the database and the word overview isn't in there. So that's wrong. C would be fine. It's correct because we have overview. So somebody reading this citation would be able to go to the works cited list with that keyword and find the source. By the way, if you do put a title of an article, right, in the signal phrase, right, because it's your keyword, it's good to use the passive construction there, because otherwise it's a little awkward to say, as overview Pride and Prejudice states, you know, especially when you get a long title. So just as explained in, as stated in, and then you can give that name and the quote. But I think the smoothest way to incorporate the keyword, if it's a title word, is the way it's done in D. So what D does is it puts the keyword in the parentheses at the end, right? And you only have to have the first words of the title when you do that. If it's a, an, or the, you want more than that. You would have the overview, for example, if it started with the. But when you do that, you often just use the name of the publication it was originally in, which is this journal that comes right after the title. So the thing after the title, you can use as your signal phrase, as stated in this journal, right? And then you can put your keyword at the end. When you do that, though, make sure that you have the quotation marks around it. You have to keep the quotation marks because the word had quotation marks. Some people put this in without quotation marks around the word, and that's really not correct. It should have the quotation marks. But the important thing here, more important than the punctuation, is that you're matching the keyword. So we have the keyword overview, and it's matched in C. In the signal phrase, it's matched in D. In the parentheses afterwards. So either one of those would be acceptable. I think the D is a little smoother, but that's how you can make sure you're using a keyed system, whether you have an entry that begins with an author's name, which fortunately most do, or even if it just begins with the title word. You're going to match that word somewhere in your in-text citation.